Point of view and narrative tenses. Who is telling the story? Point of view layer. In fiction, the point of view answers the question, who is telling the story? Obviously, you are. However, from the reader's perspective, that's not the case. When writing fiction, you want to remove every trace of your presence from the pages. You may argue that you thought you were telling your unique story, told in your unique voice. Yes, of course, but unless you're writing nonfiction, you want the reader to be deeply immersed in the story you're telling, and you do that through adding the POV layer. There are three main types of point of view, and then a couple of subcategories. First-person point of view. When the main character narrates the events as they unfold, or when looking back from their perspective, depending on the narrative tense. The reader sees the world through their eyes, experiences their feelings, and interpretations of events because they have access to their thoughts. The writer tells the story using pronouns like I and me. Pros of first-person point of view. It brings the reader deep into the mind of a character and their experiences. You get their perspective and theirs alone, with the exception of dialogue, during which someone else can share their thoughts and feelings. This form might be more accessible for some writers because it's what we use in real life. Example, The Hunger Games. Second-person point of view, rarely used in fiction. In this form, a narrator tells the story addressing you. I think this is unpopular because most readers want to be in the story, not be repeatedly being reminded that they're being told a story. Second-person point of view examples. In some genres, chick lit for instance, the narrator might say something like, "My roommate always eats the last of the ice cream. That is the worst, especially when you just had a breakup. Do you know what I mean?" This ventures into second-person territory, but is a commonly accepted device, but should be used sparingly. The story in this instance is still otherwise told in the first person. An example of a successful second-person point of view story is the series of unfortunate events. So you can see it can work depending on the story, but it's less common. Third-person point of view. When an unseen storyteller relays the events of the plot, the pronouns used are he, she, they, their, and so on. Third-person point of view subcategories. Third-person limited, sometimes called close. When a character's viewpoint is selected and the story unfolds according to their experience. In this style, the reader only knows and sees things that the selected character sees, smells, tastes, touches, hears, and feels. It's like there's a camera on their shoulder, recording his or her every turn. Example, Harry Potter. Third-person omniscient is when the narrator knows all. In this style, the writer can closely follow multiple characters and also relate information that isn't known to them. The writer can be an all-seeing and knowing eye. Example, Pride and Prejudice. Narrative tense. This relates to the point of view. Typically, fiction authors use the present tense or past tense. Present tense, the state of an action or event happening in real time. Verb examples, walks, talks, smiles. Pros of present tense, it brings a sense of immediacy. It's active. Events are unfolding in the present. Example, The Hunger Games. Past tense, the state of an action or event having already been performed, existed. Verb examples, walked, talked, smiled. Pros of past tense. Readers are accustomed to this form and it's almost invisible to the reader. The writer has more agency with sharing character perspectives. Example, Harry Potter. Multiple character point of view. How many character points of view should you tell the story in? Most books get the point of view of one or two characters. It's more difficult to go beyond that because each additional character has to have a complete story unto themselves within the story, as in the overarching story. Remember the lesson on goals, motivations, etc. It's common to alternate chapters between two main characters. That said, there are some stories that require multiple character perspectives and can be done very well. An example of this is, Game of Thrones, Les Bardugos, Six of Crows, so it can be successfully done. Head hopping. This is when a writer jumps out from this perspective character and into the thoughts or experiences of someone else. Avoid it. Head hopping. First person example, past tense. Don't do this. I sat down at the table for two and butterflies had a fiesta in my stomach. I didn't know what to expect, but the guy sitting across from me was nothing like I remembered from summer camp. He'd grown up and an unexpected smile bloomed in my face. He was happy to see me too. She no longer wore her hair in a ponytail, leaving it down over her shoulders, and was more beautiful than I remembered. Her smile was the same, warm, friendly. I'm glad I took the risk to see if she'd like to get together after moving back to town. Do you see how the narration went from one character's thoughts to another? If the story is being told in first-person point of view, the writer must stick to what that main character knows and experiences. Also, she can't interpret his experience unless she acknowledges that. So when she said, he was happy to see me too, it doesn't work. She could say his smile suggested he was happy to see her too. Head hopping, third person example, past tense. Don't do this. She sat down at the table for two and butterflies had a fiesta in her stomach. She didn't know what to expect, but the guy sitting across from her was nothing like she remembered from summer camp. He'd grown up and an unexpected smile bloomed on her face. She no longer wore her hair in a ponytail, leaving it down over her shoulders, and was more beautiful than he remembered. But her smile was the same, filling him with that same warmth of summers past. He was glad he took the risk to see if she'd like to get together after he'd moved back to town. Do you see how I jumped from her point of view to his? See how confusing that was? In any given scene, the writer has to stay in one person's perspective. It's acceptable to have a scene or chapter break and relay the second character's experience, but not within the same scene. It throws the reader off and makes for a terrible reading experience. Which point of view should you write in? Answer number 1. If writing something genre-specific, it's worth it to find out if there are generally preferred conventions. For example, in YA, first-person narration is most common, but there are exceptions, of course. It's not a hard and tight rule, but if you want your book to be widely read among the others, find out reader preferences. Tip: how? Read several books in the genre. Ask in author groups, writer groups, etc. Answer number 2. What feels natural to you? Some writers have one point of view or tense that comes more easily to them.